So let's talk through every single Warhammer 40k Combat Patrol box set and which ones are looking best and worst for 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Combat Patrols, and this one's going to be a big review of every single Combat Patrol available to each army in Warhammer 40k, and how good it is for building a larger collection in Warhammer 40k. As I'm sure most of you will be well aware, Combat Patrols are Games Workshop's discount offering for each army. Generally Warhammer tends to be at least fairly expensive, and I think the Combat Patrol boxes were initially designed as a way to make jumping into any one faction just a little bit easier than it might be if you were just buying the individual plastic kits. So you get a bunch of miniatures bundled together for £95, €125 or $160, a mini starter army that usually consists of at least one character or leader, a few battle line troops, and maybe some heavy hitting elite infantry or a vehicle or something. They're generally seen as a fairly nice way to start a faction to get a fair bunch of miniatures for relatively cheap. Compared with buying the plastic kits separately, they often have discounts in excess of 30% off, obviously presuming that you wanted the exact models that were bundled in the box set. As with a lot of Games Workshop things, you can also get them at discount at third-party retailers, say Element Games in the UK for £81, Gap Games in Australia for 21% off, or Noble Knight Games for around about 8% off in the USA. They're all links down in the video description, always quite nice to get a discount on a discount set to start with. In this video though, I thought we'd talk through each one of the Combat Patrols and some of its positives and negatives. This one's primarily with a focus of collecting a bigger Warhammer 40k army. You can of course use them to play the actual Combat Patrol game mode as well. That uses similar sort of stats, but is kind of its own thing with its own kind of balance system, and I'll admit I'm a little bit less familiar with that overall. Definitely happy to hear any insights down in the comments though, as to how any of these Combat Patrol boxes stack up in that game mode. For collecting a 40k army though, I thought we'd talk through a few of their more useful metrics, the content of the miniatures and perhaps how desirable they are for starting an army of that force, things like the unit balance, current in-game ability, and the look and feel of the models, the discount value that you get on them versus buying the miniatures separately, which definitely isn't equal between the different Combat Patrols, the amount of points that you get in the box, which can vary quite a lot, and some of them can add a lot more of a chunk to an army than others do. And then as we go along, we'll rank them by popular vote, which ones you guys like the most and which ones you like the least. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in and talk through the box sets. Starting out, we've got Combat Patrol Orks. In this one you get a Warboss in Mega Armor, the newer Deathcopters that came out in the last Ork Codex release in 9th edition, 2 sets of 10 Ork Boys, the more recent kits with a slightly more fixed weapon loadout, and 1 Death Dread. Discount wise they aren't too bad, 43%, so better than most, and you do get a fair whack of points in the box set at 530. I think you could argue that that's probably because a few of these units are a bit overcosted for what they do at the moment though, I'd say. As it goes, I think it's a fairly nicely balanced box, a bunch of greenskins in a horde, backed up by a few fun mech creations, and a big boss to lead them into battle with an enormous chopper. The individual quality of the miniatures I think is all really quite nice, most of them are quite recent, bar the Death Dread, which I think still holds up just fine, but it is a box that does have some downsides. In game at the moment I'd argue that most of the box set is probably a little bit suboptimal right now, mostly fairly playable, but the Death Dread and the Deathcopters seem a bit overcosted for what they do. Though I think that the boys are generally solid enough. I'd also bear in mind that the boys kit is the one that gets locked loadouts, so it means that you don't have the full choice of arming them all with shooters or with choppers, unlike the older kit which Games Workshop still sells. It is a bit on the unhelpful side if you want entire mobs of chopper boys or shooter boys. If they're all mixed and matched within one unit, it can just be a bit of a headache on the table. Overall though, I think it's a nice enough start to an Orky army. Definitely gets you a chunky amount of greenskin plastic on the tabletop, and does get you a fairly decent discount compared with buying them separately. For each of these Combat Patrols I asked you guys to rate them on how good you think they are. Orks are a little bit above the middle of the pack, with you guys giving them a score of 67%. We'll add on the rest as they go and see how they stack up, at least in the popular vote. Next up we've got Combat Patrol Deathwatch. In this one you get a Primaris Apothecary, Primaris Lieutenant, 10 Intercessors, 3 Aggressors, and 2 Deathwatch upgrade frames. The Space Marine specific chapter Combat Patrols are all just a bit weird in that they're basically just Primaris Marines with some upgrade frames thrown in. On the downside it means that you don't really get all that much flavour of the individual chapter. You don't get all crazy frag cannons or other fancy gear that the Deathwatch can bring, for example, just some of the Litany Xena Mortis shoulder pads. Though they do have the advantage that if you're picking them up just to play Space Marines, all of them are pretty usable for that, given that they're just basically generic models. Does mean that the discounts that you get on buying them does vary depending on whether or not you actually value the Deathwatch shoulder pads. You could say that they're quite low discount at 21% if you don't really want them, or 32% if you are, still quite low either way. For points in the box, it's not particularly standout either, 430 points, so a little bit on the low side there. I'd say Aggressors and Intercessors are okay core choices for Space Marines, likely to be units that get good again over time, though they're a little bit on the underwhelming side now. I feel like having 2 characters in the box is a bit of a weakness though. The Apothecary is quite cool, but I feel like that Primaris Lieutenant just isn't really particularly good value for what you get. You could basically kit bash one out of an Intercessor and a Power Sword if you really wanted to, plus it's not even really an optimal loadout for a Lieutenant. You can get quite a lot better out of the different options that the Primaris one has to offer. Overall, I must admit it's not one I'm very enthused about, less plastic than most, not really a whole load of Deathwatch flavour really, and neither particularly good points in the box nor good discount either. Between all that, it's maybe not too surprising that these guys rank really quite low on the list, 49% overall and in the bottom 3 out of your votes, far below the ranking given to the mighty Greenskins. Next up we've got Zombies the Combat Patrol with Combat Patrol Death Guard. In this one you get Typhus, a Biologist Putrefier that can join the Plague Marines, 7 Plague Marines, and a whopping horde of 30 Poxwalkers. Just feeling a bit weird in Combat Patrol Death Guard I think really, seeing as there's so much emphasis on the normal cultisty type humans. Definitely dominating the box over the actual Space Marines. Discount wise and points wise it's kind of middle of the road, 36% off roughly, or 495 points. Currently I'd rate everything as just about usable enough in game, and Typhus plus Poxwalkers does seem like quite a fun unit to field, though Death Guard are generally considering to be one of the armies that are most struggling at the moment. Models wise, the Plague Marines have their full multi-part plastic kit here, the Zombies will have a few repeats within the Horde, though that's probably not the biggest deal when they're all ranked up. And value-wise, you certainly get quite a lot of miniatures on the table. I think it's just not really the miniatures that Death Guard players really would have chosen first. I think they would have wanted to swap out 1 or 2 squads of Poxwalkers for some Terminators perhaps. Overall, this one sees the Death Guard as being voted as the very least favoured combat patrol. I think maybe it's a tiny bit harsh, and I don't think it's actually the worst pickup if you're new to the faction. Definitely means that you're more than covered for hardy Poxwalkers to hold objectives and things, and does get you a fair amount of points and miniatures on the board for the cost. Still though, I can see why people aren't so enthused by it. Definitely not a box that you'd have any inclination to pick up more than one of, given it's got a unique character and lots of zombies. Next up, and perhaps having a similar sort of vibe to the Death Guard, are the Thousand Sons. In this one you get the Infernal Master, 5 Scarab Occult Terminators, and then 20 Zangors. Plus you get enough 40k upgrade kits for the Zangors to give them more auto pistols and chainswords if you'd like to. Again, this one seems to be one that hinges a bit on how much you actually value those upgrade kits. If you're not the biggest fan, then it isn't the biggest saving out of the combat patrols. 25% off is lower than most, though if you do really want some Zangors armed with chainswords and auto pistols, this is going to be the easiest way to get them, as they sell that upgrade kit for quite a lot separately. Otherwise it's quite a low points box, just 410 points, one of the lowest out of any of them. And again, the unit balance of them is very heavily skewed in favour of all the Zangors. Again, it might have been nice to sub out one of those units with a squad of Rubik Marines, I feel. In game, probably the pick of the box for the Thousand Sons are the Scarab Occult Terminators. I feel like the Infernal Master is usable enough, though the Zangors are probably a bit on the weak side. Plus I feel like they're one of the units that some people really quite like and some people just aren't really that bothered about. I feel like when you're collecting Thousand Sons, the first thought isn't to run hordes of goat bird people. The kit itself was a port over from Age of Sigmar quite a while ago. I still think that overall it's not terrible if you did just want to add a bit of a horde element to a Thousand Sons army. I suspect most people wouldn't be too bothered about picking up multiple copies of this though. Might have been a bit different if there'd been some Rubik Marines in here. Overall, by your vote, the Thousand Sons got rated higher than the Death Guard but lower than the Deathwatch, at 45%, again one of the lowest voted combat patrols, perhaps missing the mark a bit for a fair few people due to an overabundance of cultist followers. Next up we've got Combat Patrol Space Wolves. In this one you get a unique Primaris Battle Leader with a wolf pelt, 10 Intercessors, 5 Reavers with the upgrade sprue, which means they could be fielded as Hounds of Morkai if you wanted, and then 1 Invicta Tactical Warsuit. You also get some copies of the Space Wolf upgrade sprues as well, if you want some wolf head shoulder pads. Again, like the Deathwatch, the discount value really does matter a lot depending on whether or not you actually value those extra sprues. It adds up fairly similar to the Deathwatch for the discount, though I'd say that you probably get a bit more plastic and value for your money here, given that you get a vehicle instead of an extra character. You get 520 points worth of models in the box here, so it's a little bit more than some of the other Space Marine boxes. And between the Phobos Reavers plus the Invicta, it has a bit of a scouty Space Marine type feel. Maybe not completely out of keeping with Space Wolves, I guess, but still not the most on theme compared with things like Wolfen, Thunderwolves, or Wolfguard Terminators, perhaps. In game currently, I'd rate all the units as basically being okay but not standout. Reavers are kind of awful, but I feel like Hands of Morkai can be interesting enough with devastating wounds, I suppose. And overall, I feel like it's not terrible for a Space Marine combat patrol, maybe just using some slightly less favoured units though, and if you want to get it for an army that isn't Space Wolves, the Battle Leader could be seen as a bit of a downside. He's very Space Wolf themed. By your guys' vote though, the Space Wolves were rated a little bit higher than the Deathwatch, but not by much. Still definitely on the lower end of the final leaderboard. I do feel like you get a decent amount more value with this one with a big chunky vehicle instead of a second character that the Deathwatch get though. Sticking with the Space Marines, let's take a look at the combat patrols for Blood Angels and Dark Angels. The Blood Angels one gets the Primaris Librarian, 5 Intercessors, 5 Incursors or Infiltrators, 3 Aggressors and an Impulsor. I think it's kind of fun that they mixed up the units that they're putting into the box a little, giving you some battle line intercessors plus some scouty type marines, rather than just giving you 10 of one flavour. Discount wise, it seems to be the best out of the Divergent Space Marine box sets, giving you a 36% discount if you don't want the Blood Angels upgrade sprues, or 44% if you do. It does really feel like there's just basically one extra unit in this box compared with some of the others, even though it does have a slightly lower points cost overall compared with the Space Wolves due to the Impulsor not really costing all that many points in game. I'd say that this one's really quite a nice intro point to starting Space Marines with a good unit mix between some elites, some troops, and the basic transport for the Primaris side of the faction, but again it's not really very Blood Angels. None of these are really 100% dedicated assault units, again due to Games Workshop wanting to put nothing but Primaris in the box sets, and the Blood Angels haven't had their Primaris style update like the Black Templars yet, so we don't have things like dedicated Death Company or Sanguinary Guard. I guess you could use the Death Company Intercessors datasheet for the guys with the guns though. Overall though, I don't think it's too bad as auxiliary forces to support a more main Blood Angels assault army. Again, most things kind of usable in game, but maybe not standout good. The Librarian could be quite nice with a 4+ invulnerable for a valuable unit to lead, I suppose. But just in general, I think it's kind of nice just for the amount of plastic that you get in the box, and a good mix of fun units. In the popular votes, the Blood Angels were ranked a bit ahead of the Space Wolves, but not by too much. I think it does feel like you just get a little bit more in the Blood Angels box than the Space Wolf one. The Aggressors are quite nice chunky infantry, and the unit variety is quite fun as well. Next up, we've got Combat Patrol Dark Angels, which is really quite small and elite. They get you a Primaris Chaplain, 5 Intercessors, 3 Inceptors, a Redemptor Dreadnought, and 2 Upgrade Sprues. Again, this one's one of the smaller discounts for the Space Marine ones, 24% if you don't want the Dark Angels upgrades, 34% if you do. But the points in the box are slightly more than the Blood Angels, given that the Redemptor Dreadnought's really quite a big tanky beast these days. Again, I'd rate Dark Angels as a very good box just for getting into Space Marines in general, and could be okay to satisfy some Green Wing type force for the Dark Angels themselves. I suppose a Chaplain is fairly on brand for them. For the units being used in game, in particular the Redemptor Dreadnought and the Inceptors are both would rate as quite good for Space Marines right now, the Redemptor being a fairly general purpose, fairly tough gun turret, and the Inceptors having their deep strike just out of 3-inch rule does mean that they can drop very close, and that can be quite handy for objectives and things. I feel like for the Chaplain you might want to give him some Blade Guard veterans or something to lead though. He's not really going to be all that effective with the Intercessors. Overall, I feel like the Dark Angels perhaps have quite a good selection of kits here, lots of models that players might value a bit more, though the actual discount isn't huge compared with some of the rest. For your guys' rating though, you have rated the Dark Angels as a bit higher than the Blood Angels again. They were all the way up on a 66% vote as opposed to 56%. I feel like the Redemptor Dreadnought really does sell this kit for quite a lot of people. They've been consistently quite strong in game for a while now, and I think are one of the better models out of the newer Primaris range. Moving on, we've got Combat Patrol Adeptus Mechanicus. In this one you get the Tech Priest engines here, the smaller Tech Priest who can give the vehicles an invulnerable save and some healing, 10 Skitarii that you can build as Rangers or Vanguard, and 3 Cataphren Servitors that you can build either as Breachers or Destroyers. They're backed up by the Onager Dunecrawler, the Spider Tank of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Discount wise, it's slightly on the low end of the Combat Patrol scale, but not by much, 33% off compared with buying these separately. A bit lower than most, but that's still a fairly reasonable saving. It does have slightly lower points in the box compared with a fair few of them at 440, though it does depend a bit on choices, depending on whether you build the Cataphrons as Breachers and Destroyers, or whether you build the Skitarii as Rangers or Vanguard. I think for the unit mix it's perhaps decent enough. A light battle line squad, a heavier gun line squad, a bigger vehicle kit, and a supporting character seems fairly well balanced to me. I'd say that all of them are solid enough choices for AdMech in game at the moment, though Admech of course are struggling overall. Cataphron breaches are certainly all the rage in terms of adding a bit of strength to the army, and they kind of require at least one battle line unit to allow them to get their massive rerolls, whether that's Rangers or Vanguard. The Tech Priest and the Onager maybe are a little bit suboptimally paired though. The Onager isn't going to care about the 4+ invulnerable save that the Tech Priest can give them. In general, he's a bit better for running with a Scorpius Disintegrator. For the models, I think the standard Skitarii are some of the nicest looking Admech models in the whole range. The Hooded Rangers in particular look very cool, I think. A lot of people tend to be a bit less sold on the Cataphrons though, even if they are quite good in game at the moment. Overall, for weight of plastic type feel, I'd say that it just adds up to a little bit less than some of the other kits in 40k. You don't really get very many points or that big a discount. I think it perhaps says more about Admech being a fairly pricey army to collect more than anything else perhaps. By the popular vote, Admech seemed to slot in just above Deathwatch, ranked as one of the lower rated combat patrols out of 40k at the moment. I can't help but think that if Games Workshop was feeling a bit more generous, they probably could have included another small unit in there. Something like some Cerberus would have been really quite nice, I think. Next up, we've got Combat Patrol Chaos Demons, and specifically Khorne Demons. In this one, you get 1 Bloodmaster Herald, 3 Blood Crushers, 20 Bloodletters, and 10 Fleshhounds. Basically the majority of the smaller models from the Khorne range of the army. It perhaps has a slightly weird feel in that you have 2 different kits repeated twice, 2 sets of Fleshhounds and 2 sets of Bloodletters. It does add up to being a fairly hoardy box with 34 miniatures in total. Compared to a few of the others, you do get a slightly better discount on this one compared with some. It's around about 45% off compared with buying the kit separately, which is on the better side of the range from Games Workshop. That's one of the best out of the combat patrols by that metric. And it also scores pretty solidly in terms of points in the box at a big 665 here. Again, one of the higher value boxes for just getting a chunk of points into a Demon's army, though I guess you could arguably say that's partly because the Bloodletters are kind of overcosted at the moment. In game, I feel like besides the Bloodletters, the rest of them are usable enough, I suppose. Competitive Demons lists do seem to go very heavy on the greater Demons at the moment though, none of which are in here of course. Model-wise, a fair bit of the box is fairly dated as well. The Bloodletters and the Blood Crushers are much older kits than most. I guess that might be one of the reasons why you get a fair few more of them than some of the other combat patrols. Another criticism is that it isn't really a very general purpose starting Chaos Demons box set. It's not exactly Chaos Undivided or anything like that. If you go in Mono God on one of the other denominations of Chaos Demons, then having a Khorne combat patrol isn't exactly going to be very worth it to you. Overall, between all that, it's got a bit of a mixed reception on the popular vote, voted 54% overall. Kind of interesting that you do get a fair amount of models and points for it, and a decent discount, but perhaps the unit mix isn't exactly what Chaos Demon players might have liked. I think it's not really possible to probably please all collectors with one combat patrol for Chaos Demons, perhaps. They did come from a place where they had to start collecting boxes, one for each of the Chaos deities, but they've gone away now. Next up, we've got Combat Patrol Adepta Sororitas. This one's largely the monopose models that came in the launch box that they had during 8th edition when they got their plastic range redone. In the box you get a Canoness, 10 Battle Sisters with Lox loadouts, 3 Arco-Flagellants, 4 Repentia plus the Repentia Superior, 5 Seraphim, 1 Penitent Engine, and a Sororitas Rhino. The Rhino is the only thing that isn't monopose. I guess it isn't entirely fair to weigh them up against multi-part plastic kits where you have the options of lots of fancy upgrades and things, but if you were to buy these direct units individually from their other kits, you'd save just under 50%, which is kind of big for an expensive army. And you get around about 500 points of models in the box here, a pretty decent chunk of a sister's army in one go. I must admit I do really quite like this box set, a pretty massive unit selection. I think that's better than any of the other combat patrols for different individual units that you get, though a few of them are kind of smaller than you might want them to be. The Arco-Flagellants and the Sisters Repentia might not have a critical mass big enough to really threaten a lot of other enemy melee units, though I feel like it does probably make this box set one of the better ones to pick up a couple of copies of if you wanted to. It makes a few of the units a bit more playable, and I feel like it's perhaps one of the most viable ones to double down on. The monopose does have some disadvantages, and you'd be missing some options, like you can't build the Penitent Engine as a mortifier, you don't get the choices of different pistols on the Seraphim, and you don't get the choice of different war gear like multi-melters on the regular Battle Sisters. But I feel like for a kit for jumping in, it's kind of handy enough, get lots of units to get some points on the table, and you can slowly build out from there. Votes wise, you guys have rated the Sisters box set at 65%, so a bit better than most, and above average on the chart overall. Definitely does have some downsides though with locked war gear choices, depends on really whether you value having more miniatures or more flexible ones. I feel like it's one of the ones that I like a bit more than most people do perhaps, or would have rated it at least a little bit higher than this myself. Next up, we've got Combat Patrol Tau Empire. In this one, you get an Ethereal, a Cadra Fireblade, 10 Fire Warriors that you can build either as a strike team or breacher team, plus their attendant drones and turrets, 3 stealth battlesuits with a drone, and the Ghost Kill with its stealth drones. This one's fairly middle of the road, both for points and discount. 38% off buying these separately, the Ghost Kill making up one of the bigger portions of that, and 460 points in the box overall. I feel like this one's definitely Tau with a flavour. Certainly a bit stealth suit heavy as opposed to going for more mainline things like, say, crisis suits for example. But at least in game at the moment, I feel like literally all of these are usable enough for the Tau Empire. The Ghost Kill in particular is perhaps the highlight, not being able to be shot outside of 12 inches, so you can put out some firepower from absolute safety. The stealth suits are handy enough for screening, and I'd probably be most tempted to pick up a Devilfish to run the Fire Warriors as a breacher team at the moment, though the strike team isn't too bad with an Ethereal, I think. Perhaps one downside is that you do have one too many characters to join the Fire Warrior unit, again meaning you might want more of them eventually. Models wise, I think they hold up kind of fine. A fair bit of the tower range is actually kind of old by 40k standards, the stealth suits in particular, but I still think that they hold up. The Fire Warriors and the Ghost Kill are relatively recent by tower standards. Overall, I feel like it's a solid enough combat patrol, decent enough discount and points in the box, and models that quite a lot of people would probably like to add to their collection. By the popular vote, that puts Tau Empire into joint first place with the Orks, voted 67% by you guys. I wonder if part of that is partly due to wanting to pick up Ghost Kills these days, now they've got a lot more interesting rules-wise. Next up, we've got the Righteous Crusaders of the Black Templars. In this box set, you get the Black Templar Marshal, their unique sculpt HQ, a 10-man Crusader squad, including their 4 Neophytes, a 5-man Intercessor squad, and an Impulsor with the Black Templar upgrade sprue, so that's one of the ones that you could give it a multi-melter. Again, with the Space Marine kits, the theoretical discount varies a bit depending on whether or not you want the upgrades, though I would say that the Black Templars ones are a bit better than most of the Primaris ones. They do actually add some fun war gear options like shotguns for the Neophytes, and some physical manifestations of their relics. Quite cool to see some actual unique sculpts for their chapter in the Combat Patrol as well. I think the Crusader Squad and the Marshal are both quite fun sculpts. The Impulsor with Intercessors in does feel a little bit on the filler side though, and you wouldn't be able to use the Impulsor to transport the Crusader Squad as they're too big. I feel like if they'd chosen to swap out the Intercessors with some Sword Brethren, then this would probably have been the perfect box set for Black Templars. Just maybe seems a little bit pointless doubling down on more battle line troops when you've already got the Crusaders perhaps. In game, I'd say that the Crusader squad is probably the pick of the box in terms of actual solid rules at the moment. They're really quite cheap for the amount of marine wounds that you put on the table at 160 points, and they can hit pretty hard in combat and move forward quite quickly with Scout. That points discount could be a bit of a negative though if you just want to get points on the table. It does make them one of the cheaper Combat Patrol box sets at just 445 points. By the voting, the Black Templars rank pretty much in the middle, scored 61% by you guys, a little bit higher than the Blood Angels, but a little bit lower than the Dark Angels one. Next up, we've got Combat Patrol Chaos Space Marines. In this one, you get the Dark Apostle with his attendant Dark Disciples, a squad of 10 Legionaries, 5 Havocs with 2 copies of each weapon, plus the Hell Brutes, which is the full multi-part plastic kit. Worth mentioning that the Chaos Space Marines are just the normal Legionaries kit, not the Kill Team one, so they don't come with the extra Reaper Chain Cannon or the Balefire Tome if you desperately want another copy of those. Discount wise, they're a little bit lower than some, at just 32% off, but you do get a fairly solid amount of Elite Chaos Space Marines for that. 575 points puts these guys towards the upper end of the amount of points that you get in one box. I think the box set is fairly well balanced for a core Chaos Space Marine force, the basic troops plus a couple of heavier damage dealers, though I'd say that in-game at the moment most of the units in the box set are somewhat mediocre right now, all fairly usable but maybe just not stand out within the Chaos Space Marine roster. I feel like perhaps my favourite one out of them is maybe the Hellbrute actually, given that he gives that aura of doubling up on the Dark Pacts. That can give you some pretty massive damage boosts if you're getting lethal hits and exploding 6s going off on 5s. Otherwise, I think that the kits are solid enough, and all of the relatively recent Chaos Space Marine range, they've all been redone in the not so very distant past, and I think that the units add up to a good little core for a Chaos Space Marine army, getting some troops and big guns available, and then being able to build out from there with perhaps some more dangerous and hard-hitting units. On the voting leaderboard, the Chaos Space Marines were ranked kinda middling once more, 61% the same as the Black Templars, a pretty standard combat patrol I think, solid enough points in the box, and fairly nice models. Next up, we've got the Golden Guardians of the Adeptus Custodes, perhaps well known to have a particularly nice Combat Patrol box set with a whole ton of points in it. In the box you get 5 Custodian Guard, 3 Virtus Praetors, 10 Sisters of Silence that can either be the Prosecutors, Vigilators, or Witch Seekers, and any of those 3 units can separate off characters or shield captains if they want, or a Knight Centura for the Sisters of Silence. The discount on the kits is kind of middle of the road, but that's kind of outweighed by the Custodian Guard and the Virtus Praetors being particularly stand out just for getting points on the table for how much you pay for them, meaning that you get an awful lot of points in the box, 670 if you build most of it as stock and just take a shield captain out of the guard squad. But if you built one character out of each of the units and fielded the Sisters of Silence as Witch Seekers, for example, you could go all the way up to something like 835. Not bad to get well over a third of a 2,000 point army out of one box set there, I guess. Overall, I do think it's a fairly standout box set. 3 of the 5 main Custodians kits, you're only missing the Alaras and the Wardens. In-game, the Custodian Guard are completely standout at the moment. The Sisters of Silence are useful to have around for some actions and objectives and things. I'd say that the bikes are usable enough casually, even if you probably don't want to play them in competitive games too much versus other options. The kits themselves are quite nice, I think. Custodians have some nice detailed plastics, and it's not too hard to paint them up and get them on the table. And in general, I certainly would rate this as one of the best Combat Patrol box sets just for raw value. It's a box with a lot of options and some big chunky models that cost tons of points in game. You could definitely double up on this, even if you might be going a little bit heavy on the Sisters of Silence that way. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the Adeptus Custodes were ranked all the way out to 82%, far outstripping the ones that we've talked about on the popular vote at least, though we've still got a fair few big challenges to them to talk about. Another one of perhaps one of the best deal combat patrols are the Genestealer Cults. This one really is perhaps surprisingly generous for fairly recent Games Workshop sculpts. In the box you get a Magus, 20 Neophytes, 5 Acolytes that you can also build as Metamorphs, 5 Aberrants, and a Goliath Rock Grinder that you can also build as a truck. Compared with a fair few of the other combat patrols, it feels like there's basically one extra unit in it compared with what you might expect. You get quite a big 46% discount on buying these kits individually, and in the box you actually get really quite a lot of points full stop. Not actually that far behind the more standard build for the Custodes at 610 points. That could vary a bit though depending on how you build some of the units. Some of them are a bit more or less depending on what model you build them as. I do kind of wonder if Games Workshop just deliberately gave the Genestealer Cults a particularly nice combat patrol army to get a few more people into them. Outside of this box, they are kind of famously expensive to collect, with a big focus on some characters, plus things like standard acolytes and neophytes that you might want loads of being really quite pricey. I feel like the existence of this combat patrol set is definitely a big credit to the faction, and it absolutely feels like one that you can double up on. Probably the biggest dead weight in the army is the Magus, but I guess you could probably convert her into another character if you wanted. Overall, nice unit mix, most of the plastic range in one box here, and at the moment Genestealer Cult are just all round very strong in game. The bulk of this box is massively competitive, particularly the Neophytes, Acolytes and Aberrants. They tend to be 3 of the staples in most competitive lists. Models wise, I feel like the looted mining mutant aesthetic isn't necessarily to everyone's tastes, but they are executed quite well I think, nicely detailed plastics, and you do get really quite a good amount of points and discount for an expensive army. Definitely a big boost towards collecting a 2,000 point force of these. Between all that, again perhaps unsurprising that they rate very very well, voted 76% by you guys, so not all that far behind the Custodes. Certainly one of the easiest ways to start collecting Genestealer Cults. I feel like you could very easily double or perhaps even triple up on this box set if you really wanted, and get the vast majority of a Genestealer Cult 2,000 point army there. Moving on to the Space Elves, perhaps one of the other dominant forces of competitive 40k at time of recording. Combat Patrol Aeldari contains a Farseer, 6 Windrider jet bikes, 10 Guardians plus their weapon platform, and also a Wraith Lord. The discount compared with buying separately is on the upper end at 40% compared with picking up these kits individually, and it gets you a pretty solid amount of points in the box, just under 500. For the unit mix, I feel like it's a nice enough box overall. Definitely a bit heavy on the jet bikes, so kind of depends on how much you want them as to whether you pick up the box, I suppose. They are kind of iconic for the Eldar though. I feel like some Guardian Defenders backed up by a Farseer is something that's really quite desirable for a lot of armies right now. Pretty big for their central mechanic of the Fate dice, with the Farseer farming out some 6s and the Guardians rustling up more dice. Most of the kits are at least fairly recent or hold up quite well. The Wraith Lord's the oldest of them I think, but still looks nice enough. Again, feels like a fairly solid core to an army that you could build out from. Kind of nice to have it focus on the more craft worldy type units as opposed to aspect warriors I think. Makes it feel like a bit more core to the faction as opposed to individual units going off and doing their own thing. Votes wise, you've voted the Aeldari in at 69%, so just shy of the Genestealer Cults there. Definitely towards the upper end of the Combat Patrol offerings, one of the more popular ones that Games Workshop has to offer. For their Dark Kin cousins, Combat Patrol Drukhari is led up by an Archon. He has a squad of 10 Cabalite warriors, there's 5 Incubi, 1 Raider and 1 Ravager. That adds up to 475 points worth of models, so fairly standard, and a fairly good discount, pretty much the same as the Aeldari just mentioned at 39%. I feel like with the room and choices in the box, they have utilised this pretty perfectly. I think it's very cool that you get 2 different skimmers in the box as well, really makes it feel like its own little army. Adds a fair bit of weight and bulk to the box that might have felt a bit on the light side if you'd had things like Venoms or other lighter things on skyboards or something. Probably for the best to focus on the Cabals as well as the focus of the box. They tend to be perhaps seen as the most core of the Drukhari, maybe a bit more so than the Covens or the Witches. In game at the moment, in particular, the Ravagers are very strong right now with their Dark Lance spam. Drukhari do seem to be oddly shooting focused at the moment. Then the Cabalites can certainly chip in, firing some shots out of their Raider as well. I do quite like the idea that you could probably magnetise the Ravager as well, have the side sponsons be able to be taken on and off, and then you could just run it as another Raider for a bit of variation if you fancied doing that. Overall, I think it's a pretty solid selection, 2 skimmers and a fair amount of pretty nice infantry. Again, if you wanted, it's probably a combat patrol that you could afford to get 2 of quite easily, getting a lot of Raider chassis hauls, carrying a bunch of Cabalites and Incubi into the battle. Overall, Drukhari are just nosing in to second best, 77% of the vote, just beating out the Genestealer Cults. Again, seem to be seen as a fairly optimal combat patrol, with a lot of miniatures that people would really like to collect if they were collecting Drukhari. Next up, we've got Combat Patrol Leagues of Votann. This one's led up by a Carl that you could also build as Uthar the Destined, 5 Chthonian Berserks, including the option for their Mole Grenade Launcher, 3 Hernkin Pioneers, and 10 Hearthkin Warriors. Overall, with the Votann points reductions that they got going into 9th edition, it's a lot less points than it used to be, 465 points now, a little bit towards the low end of combat patrols, and its discount maybe isn't ideal, down at 29%, though it is still a fair chunk off if you do want these exact miniatures. For the unit mix, I guess it's hard to go too far wrong within the Votann range at the moment. They don't really have all that many plastic kits, and this gets you 3 out of their selection. Again, definitely possibility to double up if you wanted 2 squads of each of these. Could give you the option to model up one as Uthar the Destined and one as a standard Carl as well, though I will admit that Uthar isn't particularly good in game at the moment. For in-game power, Leagues of Votann are perhaps one of the most struggling armies in Warhammer 40k right now. I'd guess they might get some points or rules changes at some point in the future. I guess that could be a positive in that these guys might be a bit more effective on the table, but on the other hand it might mean that you get even less points out of this box. For in-game rules, I feel like the Einherjar Hearthguard really are carrying the faction somewhat, so it's kind of a shame not to have any in this box. They might have been helpful to have in the box at the time of recording at least. Overall, value-wise, maybe a little bit on the lower side out of the combat patrols. Nice enough newish miniatures, though not the hugest discount compared to the other combat patrol box sets, and they are all really quite small models as well, though I suppose you can expect that collecting space dwarves. Putting them on the leaderboard, people seem to think that the Leagues of Votann box set is a pretty usable one for the faction. Again, kind of hard to go too far wrong really when the range is so small, getting a discount on 3 out of the kits is pretty good, and people have chosen to rank them at 62% overall, kind of middle of the pack. Next up, we've got another Khornate combat patrol, this time for the World Eaters. In this one, you have a fairly simple offering of 1 Lord on Juggernaut or Lord Invocators, a massive 20 Khorne Berserkers, and 10 Jackals. This one's perhaps a surprisingly hoardy box for the World Eaters, 31 very violent models contained in there, a fairly standard issue discount for a combat patrol of 36% off, though really quite a lot of points in the box due to just how many Berserkers you get. There's 460 points worth of Berserkers, and if you build the Lord as Lord Invocators, then you get a big 690 points overall. World Eaters are definitely a force with a kind of undeveloped range in Warhammer 40k so far. For their unique core type units, they've only really got the Berserkers, Jackals and 8-bound, and you get 2 out of the 3 of those in this box set. I feel like if you're collecting World Eaters, then getting 20 Khorne Berserkers isn't exactly too much really. They are likely to be a unit choice that cycles around to being good quite regularly, as I feel like they're going to be a unit that people would really like to see get good whenever they're too weak. I guess maybe having a set of 8-bound in there somewhere might have been a bit of a better balance, but overall I think it's really quite a strong pickup if you're looking to jump into World Eaters. This gets you a whole ton of infantry, then you can start adding some more serious damage dealers to that. In game, I'd say the Khorne Berserkers are okay, but maybe not stand out at the moment. World Eaters in general are kind of having problems and not winning all that many games in tournaments. I wouldn't be too surprised if they get some points cuts at some point in the future. Otherwise, models wise, they're all nice enough. Recent models from the new range, and in particular, I do quite like the way that they redid the Khorne Berserkers. I think they look really quite effective. And value wise, you do get a lot of points towards a new force. Almost 700 points puts them right at the top end of the combat patrol sets. Between all this, you guys seem to have ranked them really quite highly. They were voted at 67% overall, so the same as the Tau Empire box set, not really too far off the top dogs there. Next, for the Hammer of the Emperor, we've got Combat Patrol Astra MIlitarum. Here we've got the Cadian Command Squad, 2 Cadian Shock Troop units, a Sentinel that you can build as a scout or an armoured one, and a Field Ordnance Battery. Guard are generally fairly renowned as a pretty expensive army to collect. These guys do give you at least a fairly decent discount compared with buying the kit separately, around about 40% off, but given that these are quite focused on infantry and lightish vehicle type things, it still doesn't really add up to all that many points in game. Depending on how you build the Sentinel, it's around about 375 points, and that does make it the single lowest in terms of points cost that you get out of any of these combat patrols. I think the units in it are handy enough if you're starting out though. Command squads are generally pretty strong. Infantry squads are generally considered pretty necessary for the guard, though the Cadians might not be the optimal one at the moment. A lot of people just run their favourite flavour of guardsmen as the different datasheets if they want to. Scout and Armoured Sentinels are perhaps some of the very best units in the Guard Index right now, though the Field Ordnance Batteries are probably a bit overcosted really. Games Workshop nerfed them along with a bunch of barrage things, and in particular it made the non-indirect fire things seem a bit too pricey really. Overall, value-wise, it's a fairly good discount and you do get quite a lot of models in the box, but it's not one that's going to get you too many points towards an entire Guard army. I feel like if they wanted to put more points in the box, they might have had to include a tank of some sort, maybe a Leman Russ. Overall, in the popular vote, the Guard were ranked fairly low down, 53%, the same as Space Wolves, so definitely on the lower end of the spectrum. I can't help but think that if they decided to sub something out for a Leman Russ, it probably would have been a lot more of a popular box set. Next up, we've got Combat Patrol Grey Knights. In this one, you get the Terminator Librarian, the Nemesis Dread Knight, 5 Strike Marines that you can also build as various other flavours of Grey Knights and Power Armour, and the Terminator box set that you can also build as Paladins. This one is kind of an interesting one in that perhaps it's one of the very most useful Combat Patrol box sets out of just about any of them, but also it is one of the ones that has the lowest discount, only 20% off buying all of these miniatures separately. Far lower than the vast majority of the others, but it's still going to be something that people are going to be tempted to take advantage of, seeing as it's basically the entire Grey Knights range in one box set pretty much. Points wise, Grey Knights are really quite costly these days, with their 2+ armour on their strike squads and all their teleporting. A lot of units are just considered overcosted really, but it does mean that you get a lot of points towards a bigger army. 685 points if you build them as seen. If you take the pricier options like some Interceptors, the Grandmaster Dread Knights, plus the Paladins, then it goes all the way up to 770 points. That is quite a lot of points on the table. Again, hopefully in the balance passes, Games Workshop might give Grey Knights a helping hand, so I guess that points cost might go down a bit. In game at the moment, Terminator squads teleporting around with Librarian seems to be one of the most optimal ways to play Grey Knights. Quite a few of the options from the Strike Marine box set are also usable enough, I think. Dread Knights do seem to be a bit overcosted right now though, even for the Grey Knights faction. Miniature-wise, most of these models are getting on a bit. The Grey Knights range is perhaps one of the older ones in Warhammer 40k now. Still multi-part plastic kits with a ton of options, but perhaps a little bit behind the times, and it's not out of the question that Games Workshop might decide to give them a range refresh at some stage, particularly now new Terminators are out. It still could be a very, very long time off though. Overall though, I'd certainly rate this as one of the single best box sets to build a Grey Knight army around. Pretty much all the units that you need, and you could buy multiples of this. Just kind of a shame that the discount isn't a little bit better. That'd take it from being very good to fantastic in my opinion. Still though, despite these slightly lower savings compared with some, Grey Knights still seem to rank towards the top in the popular vote. Voted at 73% by you guys, the unit mix is very good I think. It's hard to go too far wrong with 3 different kits, all of which have really quite a lot of different options that you can build on them, plus arguably one of the best HQs at the moment. Next we have Combat Patrol Space Marines, and this one's a bit weirder and slightly harder to get a hold of as there's a few different options. You can either pick up the 40k starter set plus a Terminator Librarian independently, use the Space Marine half of the Ultimate starter set, get the miniatures out of the Leviathan box, or look on eBay for someone reselling this exact set of miniatures either out of the Ultimate set or Leviathan. Any of those could potentially be the best option depending on what you're after. In any case, in Combat Patrol Space Marines you get the Terminator Librarian, Terminator Captain, 5 Terminators and 5 Infernus Marines. Really quite a small and compact force, but with 7 big chunky Terminators and 2 of them being characters, they still have a fair amount of weight. It's kind of hard to calculate any sort of discount for these guys, really does depend on how you choose to pick them up. Perhaps the single best value for getting hold of just miniatures alone is to go halves on a regular 40k starter set, and then pick up the Terminator Librarian, or just go halves on an Ultimate starter set and just take the Space Marine half. I think with either of those, picking them up for around about £62 or $105 is quite doable, and that would add up to a theoretical discount of around about 40% based on estimated prices that multi-part plastic kits of these would go for. In general, I basically say that for the amount that you're likely to pay for these guys, they're generally going to be quite a good deal for the amount of points and the amount of miniatures that you get on the table, though probably the biggest downside to them is that it's a bit character heavy, 2 different characters and only one of which can join the Terminators. In game, I'd say that both the Terminators and the Infernus Marines are usable enough. Infernus Marines do solid Overwatch, and Terminators could be quite nice jumping out of rapid ingress. I think they could both justify themselves in a Space Marine battle line. For the miniatures, I think they've done really quite well with the sculpts from Leviathan. I would bear in mind that all of these are monopose, and I'm sure that the Terminators at least will have some multi-pose plastic kits coming, maybe the Terminator Captain as well. You will be locked into the assault cannon for the Terminators, rather than taking other things like the Cyclone missile launcher. Overall though, for the amounts that you're likely to be able to pick them up for, then it's really quite a lot of points on the table. I think that proportionally for being able to pick them up for much less than most combat patrols, the amount of plastic that you do get isn't bad either. Overall, from the popular vote, the Space Marines rank around about mid-table at 64% overall. Quite a fun and compact little force there. The flip side of the start collecting and Leviathan boxes are the Tyranids Combat Patrol. It's a very similar deal to the Space Marines in that you get most of the set in the 40k starter set minus the Barb Gaunts, then you can either buy those separately or have other avenues like pick up the Ultimate set, the Leviathan box, or someone selling them separately. In this though, you get the Winged Prime character, the Psychophage, 20 Termagants, 2 Ripper Swarms, 5 Barb Gaunts, and 3 Von Ryan's Leapers. Really quite a lot of nids there, between big ones, small ones, and medium-sized ones. Quite a fun and varied force, I think. If you compare the amount that you'd expect Games Workshop to sell these for separately compared with the Space Marine one, these would probably go for a lot more for the individual kits if they do decide to ever release them individually. I'd estimate that Games Workshop would probably charge around about an extra 50% again for the amount of models here. You do get really quite a lot more plastic than the equivalent Space Marines, though because a lot of it's not quite as elite as the Terminators and characters, they do only cost around about the same amount of points at 470. Just theoretically though, again if you went halves on an Ultimate box set, it'd be around about a 55% discount compared with the individual kits, giving it some arguments to perhaps be one of the very best combat patrols out there for getting a good amount of Games Workshop miniatures on the table. For in-game use, I feel like some of them are better than others. The Von Ryan's Leapers, the Barb Gaunts, and the Termagants I think are all quite standout. The Psychophage is useful enough, giving out its 6+ Feel No Pain type buff. The Winged Prime could maybe be okay with some gargoyles, though I'd say it's perhaps one of the weaker things. Otherwise, I'd bear in mind that the Rippers can't make a full squad yet, but I think there's at least a reasonable chance that you might have more going at some point in a Tyranid collection to make them into a full unit. And miniatures wise, with these all being monopose, it does look like the Termagants are getting a full multi-part plastic kit released with a bunch of special weapons thrown in. So these guys won't have the options for things like Spine Fists, Devourers, or the Tyranid special weapons, arguably making just the stock Fleshborer loadout basically flat suboptimal, given Games Workshop's desire to make everything cost a flat number of points and not have war gear costs anymore. Still though, I guess if you were creative, you could probably just convert a few of the Fleshborers into fancy Tyranid guns. And to be honest, the damage output of the Grunt infantry probably isn't the biggest deal anyway. They're more about holding the line and screening and scurrying away from enemy forces when they get too close. Overall, I feel like this is perhaps one of the best deals that Games Workshop has in terms of combat patrol type offerings right now. Probably about the same sort of plastic that you'd expect to get in a full-fledged combat patrol box set, but provided you can either split a box, resell, or buy off eBay, you're likely to be able to pick them up significantly cheaper. On the leaderboard of your votes, you've voted the Tyranids to be 66%, so a bit above average but not significantly there, a little above the Space Marines overall. I would probably argue that they deserve to be a bit higher than that realistically. I feel like that this doesn't really account for them being significantly less costly than a few of the other combat patrols that are all £95 or $160. Finally, and I thought I'd just throw them in seeing as we know the content of the combat patrol is combat patrol Necrons. This one was a new one that was unveiled when Games Workshop released their entire Combat Patrol rules download, though it's not been officially announced yet. I guess it'll probably be coming out with the Necron Codex at some point. In the box set, you get a Necron Overlord, 10 Warriors, 3 Scarab Swarms, 3 Scorpec Destroyers and a Plasmacide, and a Knoptech Doomstalker. As the kit hasn't been officially announced yet, the pricing also hasn't been announced. For the amount of miniatures in the box, it'd be £116 worth, $193 worth, or €154 worth. Definitely a fair bit, but I would bear in mind that if this is priced the same as the vast majority of Combat Patrol boxes out there, this would make the Necrons box the single worst discount out of any of them. It's even slightly lower than the Grey Knights. We can't be 100% sure how they're going to be delivered though. They might be in the exact same box set that you expect, but given that we haven't seen any actual Combat Patrols released in 10th edition yet, it's not impossible that Games Workshop could go for different price points. We'll have to wait and see what they do with them. Unit choice wise though, I do think that it's at least fairly excellent. The Overlord's a bit of a no-brainer as the de facto leader for the faction. Necron Warriors for your battle line unit, some snazzy melee with the Scorpec Destroyers, and some big firepower with the Doomstalker, plus some annoying Scarabs. Really quite a nicely balanced little army, I think, and pretty much all the choices at least decently usable at the moment, perhaps particularly the Warriors, who can be very intimidating to try and kill in big numbers. I think they picked a fair few of the nicer kits in the Necron range as well. They're fairly simplistic and don't really have too many options besides the Warriors' guns, but they are really quite cool sculpts out of the recent redone range in 9th edition without any of the older models that were in the previous Combat Patrol. Obviously the actual value of the set will completely depend on the price that they charge for them. I think it'd still be useful enough if it was priced the same, given that the units are quite nice, but to be anything standout, I would hope that there's some way of delivering them that isn't quite as much as the other Combat Patrol boxes. I thought it would be worth including the Necrons in the poll for completeness as well. You guys seem to be at least fairly happy with them, ranking them around about mid-table. A fairly nice collection of miniatures there, I think, though definitely does feel a little bit on the light side compared with other Combat Patrols, if they do wind up being exactly the same price. So anyway, there we have it, every single Combat Patrol box set of 10th edition. I thought it could be fun to look at the top and bottom Combat Patrols by a few of the different metrics. By vote, that means that the Adeptus Custodes win overall, then Drukhari, then Genestealer Cult, Grey Knights, and Aeldari with 69%. If you just want the most points out of your Combat Patrol box set, then if you build each unit to the max and takes the most expensive choices, the Adeptus Custodes still win at 835, though they're really not too far beyond the Grey Knights with their Paladins and Interceptors and things. They're on 770, the World Eaters are 690, Chaos Demons are up there with 665, and Genestealer Cults are 610. All of those are going to be quite big chunks towards a full army, and a fair few of those are definitely ones that you could buy more than one copy of if you wanted. Then just for rough estimated discount compared with what I'd expect Games Workshop to sell them for, the Tyranids are really quite in the lead with that. I'd estimate around about 65% off, though of course they're monopose miniatures, and getting hold of them in the exact same form could be a bit of a pain, but still massive value to be had out of splitting the starter sets. Then it'd be the Adepta Sororitas. Again, a lot of their miniatures are monopose, so maybe not too surprising they go at a bit of a discount compared with the rest. Genestealer Cults feature here as well, with 46% on a usually very expensive army. Chaos Demons again up here at 45, and then it's Orks at 43. Then looking at the flip side and some of the lowest rated Combat Patrols, the Death Guard were the least popular at 38% with their big Poxwalker focus, the Thousand Sons not too far behind with 20 Zangors, the Deathwatch with their generic Primaris Lieutenant at 49, and then the Adeptus Mechanicus and the Space Wolves at a little bit behind that. Space Wolves may be feeling a bit generic and Primaris, Adeptus Mechanicus may be just feeling a little bit lacking both in terms of points and models. I think they really could have used an extra unit in the box, even if the ones that they have included I think aren't really all that bad. For the box sets for the lowest amount of points, the Astra MIlitarum are the lowest there at 375. Really not a lot of points there when you're fielding cheap infantry and no tanks at all. The Thousand Sons are quite down there as well with 410. Zangors don't really cost a lot of points there at the moment. Deathwatch are pretty low as well. And then there's really quite a lot of things that are ranked around about the same sort of level, Black Templars and Adeptus Mechanicus following them up. Then for the lowest amount of discounts that you get, the Grey Knights are in the lead with that. I'm not going to include the Necrons here as we don't actually know their price yet. And then that's followed up by the Thousand Sons, though that is the number excluding their upgrade sprues, depends on whether or not you value them. Then we get into some slightly more reasonable numbers with the leagues of Votann, Chaos Space Marines and Deathwatch. They're all around about the 30% mark. The Deathwatch one is even including their upgrade sprues, again which might be questionable value. You would also have a couple of the other Space Marines ranked down here as well if you didn't include their upgrade sprues, Things like the Dark Angels and Space Wolves will be down here otherwise, so it kind of depends as to whether or not you value those and whether you'd include those in the calculation. In any case though, let me know what you think of the Combat Patrol sets of Warhammer 40k. Would you agree with the way that people have ranked them here, or do you think that some of them are either over or underrated, and how much would you be tempted to recommend the one for your army? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts and discussion down in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Otherwise, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.